Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Podcast Pasta. That's a podcast that's like pasta, not the podcast that's about pasta. As always, I'm your host, Mike, and today I want to do kind of a retrospective on PBS as like a programming, as like a broadcast channel. I think in recent news, I've heard that both PBS and NPR were going to be seeing a cut to their funding, and it kind of got me, I guess, a bit like reflective on like my own experience growing up with PBS programming, in particular PBS Kids programming. Because I don't know if this is really a hot take or not, but while PBS did have content more like I guess targeted towards adults. They had like documentary series and different things like that, and like certain news programs and what have you. At the very least, I would make the argument that in a cultural sense, its biggest impact was through the PBS Kids block. It was like I think their largest block. I remember back in the day, like when watching it, it was like throughout most of the day, and then obviously as it got more into like the evening hours, it switched to like again like the more like the documentary and like the news curated stuff for like adults. But by the time it switched over to that like alternative block, it was competing against network television like ABC, CBS, Fox, what have you. So I don't think it was that really like prevalent, or like I don't know, prevalent's the right word, but that really it's not. I don't think it's what PBS was known for. In short, I think most people when they think PBS, they think of the PBS Kids shows, especially in like a lot of online discourse. Now, it's one of those weird situations where when people talk about like PBS, like PBS Kids, it's not like talked about regularly, at least not like on like the larger discourse, but like occasionally you'll have somebody bring up like, oh, does anybody remember like watching Reading Rainbow or watching like Cyber Chase? And you get like a whole bunch of people talking about like, oh yeah, man, those shows were my jam or whatever growing up. And so I think it like even without us thinking about it, really like influenced our culture, right? And like the biggest touchstone of like the PBS Kids programming was probably Sesame Street, right? I think it's like even if you've never seen like PBS, even if you didn't like grow up with like PBS Kids or whatever, or I'll even throw it out there. Even if you've never seen like an episode of Sesame Street, like the Sesame Street characters. It's just that prevalent in like American culture, and it's not hard to see why. Like, I don't want to sound cliche because like everyone that talks about Sesame Street, I think, brings up this point, but it was like legitimately a show that like kind of tied everyone together, like rich and poor, like a lot of young kids like grew up with Sesame Street, grew up with these characters, and I think that is in part due to like the creativity of like Jim Henson and the crew that work at Jim Henson Studios. I think they did a lot with that show, and it's like one of the ones I like to point to it a lot because if you haven't been keeping up with it, like I can't remember when exactly, but at some point it got like sold to like not specifically Warner Brothers, but it got sold to like HBO. So like new Sesame Street content started premiering on like HBO, like the HBO block. I think it was like their Sunday block or something. If I'm like their early Sunday morning block or whatever for HBO, and then it would appear later on like HBO Max or just Max, whatever. And I think it kind of lost a lot of its charm with that. Like part of Sesame Street's charm was again like that connective, like the fact that so many people were able to just connect with it because it was part of like kind of this free public uh, programming. So like now it's that, oh, you want to watch new Sesame Street stuff, better cough up that Max subscription money, and you kind of like lose some of it with that. Like granted, not enough to like that Sesame Street isn't like culturally relevant, but I'm just saying it's kind of like an unfortunate thing, and I think it kind of highlights why PBS was such a touchstone is the fact that that it was kind of this. I don't want to say necessarily completely free. Like, I think you have like the stories of like PBS for like its entire existence, and even now because PBS kind of exists, but I'll get into kind of that more of that later. But that it's always existed on this razor's edge of like it's I don't want to call it like profit margin, but like on uh, making the money that it needs to make through like contributions and grants or what have you to keep its programming alive to like keep it up and running. Right. So I don't want to necessarily say it was completely for free. Like they had to like, not again, not necessarily make money, but they had to like build programming that nonetheless would draw in like revenue, like through donations or grants or whatever. So while not completely free, it is structured in a very different way from like other broadcast shows in the sense that it wasn't like directly profit driven, right? Because like with more directly profit driven shows, you kind of run to the issue where it's more of a. I mean, you see it now with like YouTube Kids, right? Which is kind of part of the reason why like PBS sort of died was because as we transitioned into like streaming, a lot of parents would just default to just throw on like YouTube Kids and just hope that your kid doesn't get like the Elsa farting videos or whatever, right? And but the problem with like a lot of YouTube Kids content and also like to some degree with like the for-profit broadcast like station content is that you have to kind of pull in through kids' attentions, and in that regard, you get content that isn't like necessarily best like in an educational sense, but more so that just kind of how would I explain it? Like more so that just pulls in attention, right? That like because that drives up viewership, which in turn drives up like your profit or whatever. And so and like well again that wasn't completely avoided with like PBS programming. I think it was much better like handled, right? Because it was, again, not necessarily for profit. You can like explore concepts that like I think provide a more meaningful educational experience. In most cases, there were like some bad shows. I think like in retrospect, a lot of people like detect like Caillou, for example, had like aged very poorly in terms of you know it's like educational content, right? Um, and some other ones too. I think there was like not like Teletubbies, but it was like some weird like baby spin-off of it. I don't know, it was weird. Granted, it was like for the much younger block. But yeah, so I think like there is something good to have with like, not necessarily profit driven programming that you can like curate um more, I think, beneficial content in terms of like education and to also explore ideas that I don't think would be given a chance in like regular broadcast television, right? Like I don't know, like Cyber Chase or Reading Rainbow. I think those would be like a harder sell for like broadcast television because you don't think that's like something that would like draw people's attentions, right? Like, oh, a guy reading stories or whatever. But it worked, right? Um, and I think it provided a lot of strong programming that people still remember fondly to this day. And it's just, I mean, nowadays it's I think like tuning into it, it's mostly local affiliate stuff that you find. I don't know if like they still run like the PBS Kids block, and even then like mind you they have like limited funding, so even when I was younger watching this program, because I guess to get into the more personal side of this retrospective, myself, like a lot of other kids, didn't really grow up with like cable or dish, so I didn't watch like Cartoon Network or like things like that. So most of what I would watch, because if you don't have like cable or dish, it's either like PBS Kids or like daytime, courtroom television. Sometimes I would watch like Wheel of Fortune or Price is Right. I think maybe once or two times. What was it? Wheel of Fortune, Price is Right, Family Feud. There you go. I was gonna say Family Matters, but I know that wasn't it. But like sometimes Family Feud. But no, if it wasn't like a game show that I could have watched, it would have been like PBS, kids that that I would like just kind of watch through, especially like if you were ever like sick from home or anything like that, or if it was just after school and you just, well, for whatever reason I didn't have homework, I would just like watch that for a little bit. Um, and but even when I was watching it at a younger age, uh, it was still just like a lot of like reruns, right? Like there was like no consistency in terms of like when new programming was released to like PBS. Like occasionally they would I remember they would do like this weird thing where on like a day by day basis, like they would have like some shows that would maintain like certain blocks like consistently like mind you, I'm working from like very old memory here, so I might be misremembering some aspects of it, but I do kind of remember that like some shows like had very specific, like Sesame Street always had like the afternoon, like mid afternoon block, and then like a little bit later it would switch out between like I don't know certain shows like like on some days it'd be like Zabumafu, on other days it would be like Cyber Chase or something like that. Um, but yeah, so you could tell even in those like even in like quote unquote like more of its like heyday, right? PBS Kids always kind of struggled to like maintain its like programming consistency, I think, in some ways. Um, but no, I think even for like my own podcast, I because I've talked about like before on like with interviewing and talking with other guests is like kind of one of the influences for like the direction of the show, especially like nowadays, is like a lot of PBS programming where it's not I don't really do this that much for like views or like listenership because look, I've been doing this like for 5 years, right? At this point, if people aren't listening, they're just not listening. What do you want me to do? But I just do it to kind of just for myself, like it's helped me like gain um a lot of skills that I don't think I would have had otherwise. And I do kind of have like a passion for like content creation or like talking about media and like discussing it and like talking about like art and things like that. And I never want to like fall into the trends of like just like the tension market hellscape that is modern YouTube, right? Where everything is just a derivative of like, the usual like Mr. Beast or Logan Paul or whatever crowd. I kind of want to like break away from that. And admittedly, like just being in this ecosystem, you can't like avoid that, right? Like I admit, like I've been like more, I guess sometimes clickbaity with my titles. I apologize if you accidentally listen to any of my episodes with that, but it's just it's you kind of have to play the game on this platform if you want to get like any listenership, or any viewership, listenership, or whatever, because it's just the state of like modern online content creation. And I'm sorry, I don't want to like fixate too much on this point because it's kind of like taking away from like my whole whole PBS Kids thing. But I'm just saying like a part of my inspiration of like just providing, I think, more like content that I think is more like meaningful for me as opposed to trying to play for like a profit driven like attention seeking aspect of it, like more of a personal thing, right? But I mean, who knows? Either way, I think it'd be really unfortunate. I think it is kind of unfortunate that um, PBS is gonna like and NPR to some degree is gonna like see this like undercutting to their funding, because I do think that there is like still a potential for that type of like system, where, it is like publicly funded television. I think there is like a social utility in that, in the fact that we have something that isn't just so like corporatized and focused on like grabbing your attention, but that, provides like more meaningful like content, right? More meaningful like programming to people. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know. But I guess I don't know, to boost engagement or anything. If you made it this far in the episode, thank you for listening. If you want to like, I don't know, kind of talk about like what was your experience with like, did you grow up with like PBS or PBS Kids because you didn't have like cable or dish, and like what were your favorite shows? For myself, I brought up like I liked reading Rainbow a lot. I also did kind of enjoy like Cyber Chase. I don't know. I think like I guess I would say kind of like the art style of it. I remember like liking the show like that. And I think it was like one of the few programs that focused on like, I think it was like for somewhat older audience, like in terms of like math and stuff like that. Zaboomafoo is like great show because the animals are cool. Like, admittedly, I'm not a big animal guy, but like animals can sometimes be cool, right? Um, Arthur is like a classic. I think Arthur was like the longest running animated series, certainly on PBS, but I think maybe in like television in general. I know it's not the longest running. That obviously goes like Simpsons, but it's definitely like up there. Like I think it ended like only a few years ago, right? Um, and I'm trying to think. I like. There's a few other shows that I'm kind of remembering here and there. Like there's Rough Men that I know some people like, but I was like kind of outside of like when I watched like PBS Kids. Word Girl is kind of the same thing. I think only Word Girl because there's like a weird reference to like Invincible in it or something. More so for the comic than like the show, obviously. Um, but yeah, and then you have like the staples like Barney, right? And like Thomas the Tank Engine, kind of. I think that was like kind of like a weird shared programming block with like BBC or something like that. I can't remember exactly. Um, but yeah, I think that is going to do it for me. And this episode is brought to you by the letter P for pasta. Obviously, you dumbo, you dummy, you silly goose.